بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الجليل الكريم الممين الأكيد الوحيد العزيز الحفيظ السمان المليك الحكيم الولي الوهاب الحق السلام. Ya Rab, please guide my tongue so do not misguide others. Inspire me with wisdom and help me to bring clarity. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Jummah Mubarak. When I was in the process of converting in Ramadan 2 years ago, Ramadan coming up right here, I started to experience a series of marifas. Now you might say these weren't legitimate marifas, and so I put an asterisk on them. But I'll share them anyway. One of the key ones is that there's more than one sunnah. So like many converts, I was struggling with the idea of sunnah. Like, okay, there's the Quran. Quran says certain things. It's another canonical book from God through a prophet. And it's against idolatry and it's against injustice. Makes sense. But with the eating with the right hand, why is this? Why do I gotta wear a thobe? Why does God care about this? Why would God care about this? Does God care about this? And I started to have this insight that through the other prophets, there are different sunnahs, there's different colors, and they create a color wheel. And just as God's message has different tones and creates a procession of music through these different messengers, their overall ethos and way of being is similarly diverse, yet concordant. In the same way that color is all light. And the 5 major colors that came to mind were of Adam alayhi salam wa salawatu, of Enoch alayhi salam wa salawatu, of course of Christ and Muhammad alayhi salam wa salawatu wa jama, and lastly of David alayhi salam salawatu. So one represents a primordial understanding of spirituality and energy, which we see remnants of in the Hindu body, in the traditions of the Vedas, and in various occult practices. These are all corruptions, of course. This is the oldest sunnah, so it's been the most corrupted. And also, as I've stated before, Hindu is an overestimation of the cohesion in the body of regional beliefs and practices. And then there are different traditions that are blends of these different sunnati. So the blend of Enoch, which is of knowledge seeking. So when Albert Einstein had an intuitive, comprehensive leap to synthesize this holistic theory of general relativity, it was an Enochian sage experience. And likewise, Plato and Shakyamuni, the Buddha, where this was mixed with the Adamic legacy. So whereas Occidental Buddhism, which is really what Platonism is, and it lacks a negation of monism, and it lacks negation of al-haq, of the one, which is arguably not the original teaching of Gautama Buddha, but nonetheless is quite crisp in its intellectual forebear. Similarly, Hermeticism and Pythagorean tradition were in this vein. And the Enochian Sunnah is something that one does not need to be a prophet in order to attain the ayati. It is intuitive, intellectual, and an extension of fitra. And in its most extreme corruption, it is the Tower of Babel. It is the technological singularity, as seen in a sci-fi plot involving a villain who attempts to ascend to a technological supremacy. And then the mixture in Buddhism is interwoven with the energy and meditation traditions rather than being an exercise in constructive logic. And the Sunnah of King David, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is emphasized in Zionism and hegemonic empire, such as of the British, who had fancied themselves successors to the House of David, and also, by extension, the American empire. And that then is a fusion of the Davidic Sunnah with the Christian Sunnah. So we'll be imperialists, but we're going to try and frame it as a beneficence. So this is, of course, also corruption. There can be corruption in these things, of course. That's why you're here. And then Sikhism is a blend of the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad wasallam and of the Adamic tradition. And there are other combinations, of course. You might say that the Sunnah that I am upon is a blend of Enoch, Christ, and Muhammad. I lack the dunya power to have any claim to a Davidic, even though I descend from the same group of people who claim a descent from antiquity to Teotefi and this whole British Israelite theory. I have not yet inherited that sunnah. Perhaps I can combine all of these one day, inshallah. And my wife is, as you may have heard in the interview I did with her a couple of weeks ago, she's very much in the Buddhism blend of Enochic, sort of Platonic mental cultivation and the Adamic energy cultivation. This is somewhat alien to me. So each of these energies, each of these wavelengths, it's all one energy, but it has different attenuations, have a feedback effect with each other. And this feedback effect plays out in history. And so we consider the dilemma or multi-lemma, trilemma. There's a lot of lemmas. The conundrum of how to behave as servants of God in this era where the bar for Muslims is set so low, and yet the need is so high, the need for clarity. So I'm in a Batini Shia chat group, and it's been quite interesting. So the Aga Khan, the Imam of the Nizari Ismaili Muslims, who I do indeed believe are Muslims, died this week, and his son Rahim, who's 50 years old and seems to be in good health. He's a middle-aged but young as far as religious leaders go. he's been appointed as the successor. And Wahid Azal, the sheikh of the Fatimiyya Sufi order, he's got a very good YouTube channel where he did a course last year on Vessels of Wisdom by the Fusus al-Hikm by Ibn Arabi. And now he's doing a course on Mullah Sadra. So I highly recommend you check out his channel, as I mentioned him a few times. So Wahid Azal got into the group about a month ago, maybe a month and a half. And he left this morning, and he got into a discussion with a nice 12er chap who I believe is also from Australia about the nature of jihad. So he criticized the Aga Khan lineage for being wealthy and having gone and made friends, married into the Windsor family. They moved to Portugal to improve on their tax efficiency for inheritance. So currently, and this is paying off now, there's going to be a $13 billion estate that's going to pass into the name of the next imam, and then he's going to distribute the yield from this and continue to collect. I think it's 10% of the income of the Ismaili Muslims, and a lot of them are in um, Gorno-Badakhshan in Tajikistan, and the other Badakhshan region in Afghanistan, where they're being persecuted, or they're in India, Pakistan. And their income isn't tremendous. So then they have this raft of Ismailis, which perhaps were galvanized by the example of their imams who went west and became entrenched in Western property rights. And they are Westerners now. They live in Canada, the United States, the UK. And they make money, and that fuels the trust, which is not a formal trust. I do believe they have structures of trust, legally speaking, but the beneficiary is ultimately the imam, and the successor to the imam is appointed in the will. So they've managed to create a crisp, purely commercial power structure. They have no military, they have no nation. They're not like Iran, where they piggyback on the West. And $13 billion sounds like a lot of money, but when we're talking about this sort of scale of a nation, it is not really a lot of money. $1 trillion is a lot of money. $100 billion, now we're kind of getting somewhere. So there are Latin American nations, for instance, the Central Bank of Bolivia has somewhere around that amount of billions under their control. So you can think of the Aga Khanate, the Ismaili Nizari Imamate, as being a distributed nation, a network state, if you will, that is on the scale of Bolivia in terms of its economic footprint. And then, of course, the individuals at the top, the family, they live very well. They are essentially billionaires. They live on, they can expend multiple millions of dollars on themselves um, per year if they wish. They own a yacht, quite infamously. And in the Ismaili worldview, they are a manifestation of the universal soul, which is an imperfect yet um, good and divine and aspiring to perfection element of the Neoplatonic emanations from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the first intellect, salawatullahi wasalam, which is essentially all the prophets. So I'm more amenable to this in a sense than to Sunni doctrine of one prophet being made distinct in contravention of the Quran. This is, and a lot of Sunnis dislike this Neoplatonism, and they say it's kufr, what have you. But um, seems more chronic, and I've discussed repeatedly why I am not a Neoplatonist, but I don't think it's that bad. I just don't think it's particularly true. But when you believe that an imam is actually a perfect human being, and then they're photographed on their yacht with their young paramour, and they're, it's like, well, the man's he's going to die in a few years. Let him be intimate with the young woman who's obviously she's in it for the money, but okay, it's a good ticket, and they're having a nice time jet skiing around the yacht, and then there's going to be a meal. It's like, let them enjoy life, right? It's not a sin to have wealth, but in my ethos, it is not. It doesn't matter if it's a sin or not. I mean, of course, the enemies of the Ismailis, which is a lot of Muslims, will go that far, but it's that what is perfect is to optimize the benefits, right? So if you liquidated that yacht to somebody who probably doesn't care about the poor and is not banking hasanat for their afterlife, and their fate is with Allah, and then you take that money, you take that 20-30 million dollars, and you go and you build homes and you buy farms and you put people to work and you feed people and you change perhaps hundreds of people's lives. This is the problem with these things, is that $1 billion is $1,000 for 1 million people, or it's $10,000 for 100,000 people. So Chile did a pilot to bring Syrian refugees here, and I know this because I spoke with the lawyer who was involved, who was my lawyer, who got me my permanent residency visa when I was at risk of losing it right at the end on a hitch. I just mailed in the forms, but anyway, um, and they'd spent about $32,000 per person. They spent $2 million. A million was on Chile's side, million on the UN side, and they brought over, therefore, 60 people, approximately, or we're only talking about like a dozen families, right? So I'm thinking about maybe spending like $100,000 relocating, like, and building homes for like two Gazan families, maybe three, and doing it a bit more cheaply, um, doing it with a bit more of a pastoral, rustic strategy in the budgeting. But it's expensive. This is why we have a situation like running Saudi Arabia, that your sovereign wealth fund of around $1 trillion is, I mean, it's actually, it's an interesting comparison to consider 15 million Nizari Ismaili Muslims, perhaps 3 or 4 million of whom are in the West and are economically self-sufficient and exporting wealth into the trust, into the meta sovereign wealth fund of the Agahan Development Network, versus 40 or 50 million. There's been a fair amount of immigration, although they're not all citizens, so they would not be beneficiaries of the state policies, but of Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has therefore more money, right, per capita, and by definition, nobody who's well, they don't have they don't have worldwide taxation. So any citizens who are abroad and are in this position of like Khalil Andani being a professional in the West, by analogy to these Ismailis, is not paying tax, and actually they don't do tax, which is why it's halal to take money from a Saudi investor, because they do not necessarily support the Saudi regime in facts of money or or personally. They're simply, so that's a crack in the door. This leads you to maybe alluding to this theme of the nuance of what is shirk and, or not shirk, what is nifaq, what is acceptable. So anyway, Wahid got into it about he kind of decried the Aga Khans for being Western sellouts. Now Wahid lives in Australia himself, and then he pointed out that he's a Bayani, so they're a branch that's more radical, and didn't think that the Safavids or the Qajars were good enough. And he's critical of the Maulas of the Iranian Shia 12 Shia orthodoxy. But he was saying that the eighth Imam, this is not an Ismaili Imam, this is the other. This would be the son of Musa, was assassinated through poisoning, even though he was in the court and he was sort of subverting them, but he had not really sold out. And so he used this as an example of how you always have to be trying to fight the power structures. And it's also a good example of how you can play the long game, and this is what would separate Shia from, in their understanding of jihad, from the Hawarij, who believed that Ali, alayhi salam, had committed a major sin by making a peace treaty with Muawiyah instead of fighting him to the death. Whereas Ali was weighing the cost of believers' lives and also trying to prove to everybody in history that Muawiyah was indeed a munafiqun by giving him the opportunity to break the peace treaty. As the hadith says, that one of the signs of hypocrisy is violating agreements. And he was not given the opportunity, he wasn't given the time to have that play out, that strategy, because he was assassinated by one of the Hawarij, very tragically. One of the great misinterpretations of the Quran in the history of Islam, but not the last. Oh no, not the last. And so then when we look at the Ikhwanis, who tend to be Nasibi Salafis, who are active rather than in this passive Saudi position, then we see a similar, perhaps, misinterpretation where they mix it with the fiqh that it's okay to kill civilians if it's incidental, if you're not like trying to do it. But then, of course, some of these guys, like on October 7th, went ahead and did. So I've gone over this. I don't want to ruin the vibes too much in these contemplations with all these tragic details. And this is, in fact, a great corruption in the tradition that's been going around for a while, that it was taught in fiqh books that this hadith saying don't kill non-combatants is attenuated by various clauses and opening the door to more tragedy. And of course, this is why Muslims have a reputation outside of their lands as being basically evil. So they earned it, and their scholars paved the path. And I don't takfir them, but I don't think they're very good for doing that. I think they will be accountable. And so ultimately, Wahid's position is that you have to always be fighting, even though the Bayanis are only a few thousand people, which is his group, that they're the true Shia because they don't sell out to the West. And like the brother that runs the group, Balam, is notorious for kind of cold posting about Sunnism. So you would almost think he's like a Quranist or a Hadith rejecter for that. And indeed, like there's different angles of Hadith rejection, right? There's the Abadi angle, this is partial, but ultimately upholds a lot of the bad Hadiths. There's the Shia one, which is less partial, still partial. Um, the Ismaili one, because they didn't have to fall back into Usuli Shia constructivism of fiqh with this guardianship of the scholar, the Wali al-Faqih, that there's is a stronger amount of hadith rejection. Ultimately, they're interested in the hadith of the living imam, first and foremost, because that's what they believe God has entrusted for them to follow. And other things are salient to context. And then this bleeds into Islamic modernism, which is this contextual decoupling of Quran and Hadith. So Quranists tend to not decouple the Quran, they more just the Hadith, which makes a certain amount of sense in their reading of the Quran. And then modernists tend to say, well, this doesn't apply anymore. The jihad thing doesn't apply really that much anymore. Um, the headscarf is an easy one. That's a little less heavy, and so on. Now, in my position of Mutazili, I am not as decoupling of context as Islamic modernists, even though they would be the sort of de facto inheritors of Mutazilism without the sort of madhab revival that I'm trying to pursue, inshallah. And rather, I would take more conservative fiqh on a number of issues than, say, Mufti Abu Layth, who is not a Mutazili. And then I would be like harsher on, for instance, Muawiyah than he would be, because I'm not a Sunni. If that's what being a Sunni is, then that's the line. So obviously in the Zaydi school, they say it's impermissible to say the Radiallahu after speaking the name of that tyrant, who was one of the greatest corruptors of Islam that there was, and yet they do not curse the other caliphs, which is sort of the position I take. So you might say I'm a Zaydi in that sense, though I am not of the thick of the Zaydis, such as what has been practiced in Yemen. And I guess the point of all of this is that it's important for us to take the opportunities of appreciating God's creation vis-a-vis each other, vis-a-vis all of these thoughts, which are all imperfect, just as I believe the imamate of the Agahan is imperfect, or any Sufi sheikh, Wahid Azal and Pir Zia, and all of these people, the saints of history, and so on, they're all imperfect. They're all human. I don't believe in Isma either. I don't believe that the prophets were perfect. I believe the beauty of their stories is how they're in their imperfection, they persevered in their struggle to make Tawbah, to continue to promulgate the truth when it was perennially unpopular and even inducive of a violent end. And so, my message in this khutbah today is to appreciate the resonance of the Ayati Allah, to appreciate the Sunnati Allah, the color wheel, the interaction of these ummas, the interaction of these sects, the interaction of all these minute positions. And what is the best position? Well, clearly, obviously, like everyone else, I think my position is the best. I've invested a certain amount of time and energy into refining it into what I believe is optimal. And that makes me a mu'mineen, but I respect that you're a Muslimin. So everybody, the Shia say, we're the mu'mineen and you're a Muslimin. And the chill Sunnis say, well, they're Muslims. They're not on hawk like we are, right? And so on and so forth, right? Everybody either takes that position or they say, oh, they're not Muslims. They go hard on it, right? Which is the danger. So if you walk the paradoxical fine path between sectarianism and being a total Murjite and just saying, well, it's everybody's just entitled to their own opinion, then this is the sort of we're on the highest ground, and then there's different tiers of correct. And indeed, this is what the Quran is calling us to debate with the best of language with the people of the book. And there's a difference between this and perennialism, in that they're not all equally valid. There is an altitude in question, and there may not be just one. There may be local maxima. There may not be one peak that is the most correct position. So we also have this element of individual personality biases. So Mutaziliya is more appealing to me because I am a sort of smarty pants intellectual. So then my my test is to not be arrogant in that, and to believe that, well, I've read all of this and I know more than these scholars, even though I do have a greater breadth of knowledge, perhaps because I've not been heuristically steered away from that breadth. I don't have the depth of knowledge of Mufti Abu Layth when it comes to, or other Ajazi scholars when it comes to hadith and so on. I don't have the breadth of knowledge. I don't have the depth of knowledge when it comes to knowing the Quran front to back. I have a conceptual map of the Quran that I've reinforced in my contemplations and studies, and that I continue to reinforce. But I'm not an expert in the Quran. I'd like to be able to recite more in Salah this Ramadan, and to be able to actually quote maybe a translation, maybe not in Arabic, but quote more verses accurately, and instead of just alluding to them as my current conceptual map permits. And it is in this knowledge of our limitations and the humility of knowing thyself. He who knows himself knows his Lord. This isn't shirk. This is one of these non-commutative theophatic things. Nor does this mean there's also the one that your Lord will be as you think of him. This is not to say that God is a completely subjective creation, but that the theophany is a reinforced feedback loop. This is the feedback. This is the theme of today. And so if you believe God is this harsh, one-legged, two right-armed overlord, then this is what you will experience as you tighten the mercy against you and try to live up to that. I don't think it's a good path. Or you might be too wishy-washy, or you might be, there's different ways you can theophatically pull your deen and color it. And it's important to learn from each other. So for instance, I was listening to a live stream of Daniel Hakikachu, who's quite upset about Trump's plan to relocate the Gazans. Now, on one hand, I'm a bit relieved that these people may well be getting homes and getting fed consistently and getting their kids in school and getting the healthcare they need. And I can't afford to do that. So, indeed, the empire in this Davidic Christian blend is coming in to offer their perhaps false mercy. And indeed, of course, they're robbing these people. And yes, of course, the Hamas has not been the best government. They have not been the best mujahideen. They haven't followed the Sharia strictly. So there's a lot of faults all around. But ultimately, so I've been a bit vexed by all of this, and it's been a bit personal because, for instance, I spent 2 months of expenses recently in trying to just have a few families get a few days of food here and there. Just the powerlessness that I have in this regard is not absolute. The hasanat is real. Perhaps it's diminished by me talking about it, but I'm not. My intention isn't to go try to convey how great I am. Rather, it's to be realistic and to discuss that it's very challenging. This dunya is very challenging, and when if you just kept your money to yourself and you're like, well, these people, whatever, or you maybe you were like, okay, you like that, you retweeted a few things, and you kind of move on. It's easier because you don't have to engage with these conundrums, and so it's a great challenge for us to actually figure out. We all, like Daniel Akikachu and I, have very different understandings of what is right, what God wants, what is Islam, what is legitimate to be, and so forth. You can watch his debate with Dr. Javad Hashmi, who I'm closer with. He's more of an Islamic modernist. He doesn't believe in jinn. He doesn't go into this Batini stuff. He's a Zahiri. He's a nice guy though. I like him a lot. I'd love to go on his channel sometime. He's been kind of low key, not. I think he's just been doing operations and waiting for his dissertation to finalize and get his PhD. But Hakikachu was not nice to brother Javad. Called him a murtad in the opening That's how he finished his opening statement. He had a domino meme of where the little domino is child marriage and slavery, and the big domino is belief in God. And it's like, obviously, my epistemology is it couldn't. I don't want to say could not be more different. It could be more different. He doesn't believe that endless sectarianism against Shia is healthy. So this is like he has some good points. Brother Muhammad had a video about how we need to give him a little credit for getting on the Anti-Defamation League's list, and the NSA is keeping an eye on him. So even though Mr. Hakikachu is a Michigander par excellence, I mean, he's very culturally American. Is the funny thing, but he's wearing the thobe, but he's paying taxes. He's not doing a tax protest. He's not going. I think if he was really really willing to do jihad, he would do a tax protest. So I live outside of the United States, so I can parlay income into the mouth of the Chilean government, and I get a foreign tax credit. And the rates line up in a way where I can manage to not pay taxes to the United States. Um, I am planning on paying a little bit of tax, of corporate tax, just to consume a net operating loss and to give away a greater amount of money to Palestinians. Probably a Ugandan orphanage, not the one that Brother Muhammad was promoting on his stream, but another one that I know of that I've already sort of said, okay, I've already made my pledge. I gotta cash that check, and but then basically I don't intend to pay any tax to the United States after that, except for if I get nipped up for a couple $1,000 here and there, I might do it. Um, and I might put in $800, and then I'll get back like $400, perhaps next year, um, for in a tax credit, in order to qualify for minimum Social Security, because it's just like it seems like a good financial idea. You never know. I might be old and broke in about 20 odd years. And maybe the dollar will be devalued and inflated by then, perhaps. But still, relatively speaking, I don't have any other retirement at this time, so it seems like, and I'm a few credits shy. So this is like, maybe is that haram? I don't know. But the point is that by and large, I'm not intending on really putting any substantial amount of money in the coffers of the United States. And I was considering a deal to launch my project with an asset that is backed by U.S. Treasury bonds. And I was deliberating about it, and I thought, this is a real problem, because now what am I? If this goes well, I'm going to be shoveling millions of dollars into the U.S. Treasury to support Voom, right? And that's not acceptable. And ultimately, I prayed on it, and then the the CEO of the company that issues this T-bill asset was outed as like the Harvey Weinstein of this industry that I'm in. He'd been meeting women in bars to like talk about their careers and then trying to drug them. There were allegations, at least. And this came out right as I was deliberating on this and I was making my duas. I think I made 3 or 4 duas, and then in the subsequent days, I had these marifas of how to design a technological alternative that's much better anyway than what I was planning on doing. So this is like, to me, this is like the minimum. Is like make dua, ask God for guidance, get feedback from God. You're in a relationship with God. Likewise, overcome your sectarianism by taking feedback from those who criticize you. So, for instance, the amount of sectarianism against the Ismailis this week has been hellfire, and there were a lot of things against them, obviously, and cursing their imam and so on. And then somebody was like, well, what if the new imam
just that tells them that they have to fast and pray. And so, of course, they actually fasting is not discouraged. It's just they're not threatened about it. But a lot of Ismailis do fast in Ramadan, and a lot of Ismailis do make Hajj to Mecca, even though it is considered acceptable for your Hajj obligation to go and see the Imam when he visits. So it's a more economical solution. He goes to Tajikistan, and everyone goes, oh, they all line up, and they're never going to afford Hajj, so it's kind of academic. And then there's this middle ground of people like Balaam, who is also supportive of the West, and he thinks the West essentially has the moral high ground, which they might, but it's not because it's not the highest moral ground. It's just that the Muslims have been creating so many refugees in these sectarian wars and bleeding for Zionism that it's like the least bad option, but it's still not acceptable. And for the Western hegemony to intensify its oppression is definitely not acceptable. This is where I take a stark contrast with the brother. And may Allah guide him, and may Allah guide us all. And one way that Allah guides us is by helping us to answer this test. So, in my last talk, I talked about how it's disheartening that there's so many bad interpretations of the Quran, and that the Quran does not make itself easily interpreted, despite what some Quranists might say, when they can agree on their tafsir. And don't then fall into, just because a lot of people are falling into shirk, trying to make sense of the Quran through other, not the diverse epistemology is shirk. The Quran endorses certain things as contrast to deepen your wisdom and therefore unlock the Quran. But rather that there's a lot of troubling behavior by Muslims, and they can justify it with verses. So then you might say, well, like maybe you lose faith in God. You might think, well, this is just man-made, or you might think that God doesn't care that much to give us good guidance. And something like Shiism is like, well, no, there's this ecclesial branch that continues beyond the Quran. And then my thing is that there's this much more dispersed wahi of the Ruhudus that we can attain. So there's this whole other dimension of wahi, of revelation, other than textual revelation. And it isn't even titrated through one particular bloodline. These bloodlines are just manifestations of dua that have been answered, and that they were such ambitious dua, such as the dua of Ibrahim sallallahu wasallam, which created a whole lineage of prophets. But it's not the only prophet. They're not the only prophets in the world, right? There was Zarathustra, and others, alayhi salam. So, therefore, if we do not fall into disbelief from religion not being a super clean instruction manual, and we instead appreciate that this is a part of the challenge. This is the game. It's a contemplation game, and also it's a game of diplomacy between the different groups who have contemplated differently. And in the feedback, we can deepen our understanding. So, for instance, Wahid left the Bettini chat group, and Balam had harsh words for him after he left. Of course, that was relevant, I guess. But I thought it was interesting because I would rather that instead of Wahid just kind of hanging out and saying a few things over like a couple of years, that he like really throw down the smoke bomb like a ninja and vanish and like really say something and get me thinking. And likewise, all of these Sunnis criticizing saying Ismailis aren't Muslims because they pray differently. Well, if you believe in the Quran, then you know that that's not necessarily enough to get them out of Islam. That they do 18 rakas a day, and they'd say a bunch of they mention all the imams, but there's 49 of them, so it's quite a mouthful. But they do it after the course salah. So it's just as like making the Durud Sharif of Allahumma Salih Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad, which I don't even do because I don't think that's. I think that's making distinction between the messengers. I just say Salamu ala Marsalim wa ana Allahim, which includes me because we're all and you probably we're all descended from prophets just because they've been in the background of the gene pool for so many centuries. So you might as well bless yourself and everyone, pretty much everyone else, with the Wana Alahim. We're not just talking about a few historical persons that were their immediate family members in that time. Um, and then I say Alhamdulillah Rabbi Alameen, and I finish my dua. So that's my Nia Mutazili take on the fiqh of sending salawat and of including family members, and therefore I fulfill all those hadiths, all the chronic verses, the one about the salawat and not making distinctions. So I'm sending salawat on all the prophets with no distinction. I'm mentioning the families. It's all good. It's clean. It's simple. And it's also, who knows how those blessings will reverberate because of how genetic dispersion works. So, maybe the new Ismaili Imam actually tightens up, right? And like Mufti Abu Layth got feedback, right? And it was rude feedback. They broke into his house. And that shocked him in a way more than all of the hate groups on the hate pages that people would make on Twitter or Facebook. And it's amazing the amount of traction you get from like engagement is good for internet presence. So this people probably helped Mufti's YouTube presence by generating clicks, and then people would go hate watch him, and then they would have they go, well, that's actually correct, like he's citing that hadith, and that, like, he's not. I don't disagree with that interpretation of that. I disagree with a lot of his fiqh positions. I disagree with how he looks. I disagree with how he's laughing about things. I disagree with a lot of things, but he would get people thinking. And likewise, we've had interactions between like brother Farid, who's a almost borderline Nasibi, uh, but not quite. More of a classical Sunni, and brother Muhammad, who's your hardline Quranist, and so on. So by coming and having these useful interactions where we're polite enough with each other to actually learn something, we can really deepen our contemplation of key questions, and in this fashion, not only avoid the sectarian shirk of coming to hate each other, but we avoid oppressing our own souls by denying ourselves the opportunity to learn, and then we can attain a better understanding of how to wage the jihad within and without. And it is in this process of feedback that we succor the great depth and richness of Allah's creation. And inshallah, enrich the ummah and the other ummahs by example. And wouldn't it be nice